Welcome and thank you for listening to the Civic Space today with Southern Defenders, a podcast that explores the status of the civic and political space in the Southern Africa region by unpacking critical issues that shape the civic and political space. My name is Madata Mloja and I am your host for today's conversation. Today's episode draws attention to Zimbabwe and reflects on the role of the government in safeguarding the civic and democratic space. The episode draws perspectives from the mayor of the city of Harare, His Excellency Jacob Mafume. A Zimbabwean politician who has served as the mayor of Harare since September 2020, has a background in law and has served in the country's main opposition. His contributions to today's conversation reflect on both the role of the national government and local government through his lens as mayor. We will talk about the positive and negative impacts the government has had on the civic space and close off with best practices and challenges associated with implementing them. Mr. Mafume, welcome and thank you for joining today's conversation.
Thank you for having me here. It's always a pleasure, and thanks for the kind words. Quite flattering, but I hope we'll be having a useful conversation.
Thank you so much. I have hinted a bit on your profile, but I always like to start the conversation by asking my guests how they define themselves. So how would you define Jacob Mafume?
Well, I'm just an ordinary person trying to make Zimbabwe, Harare, a better place, trying to go back to the basics. Very simple, really. I grew up in the rural areas, came to town. It was a far much better place than what it is now, and we're hoping to restore its former glory, look at the quality of life, be able to serve the people, be able to be of service to the nation. The people did invest a lot in my education, in our education. To become a lawyer, we didn't pay anything. At that time, we were actually paid to learn. So I do believe that I owe a fiduciary duty to the populations and to those who invested in our education, who I believe are shareholders in everything that I do, and that I must be able to make sure that their investment did not go in vain.
Thank you so much. I love where we're starting. I think I love the fact that you've painted the Zimbabwe we want. I think it's a very good start to today's conversation. And like I said already, that the topic really is on the role of government in safeguarding the civic and democratic space. And I wanted you to start by giving context to what you would say is the current state of the civic and democratic space in Zimbabwe.
Well, currently we are at the peak of what democracy stands for in terms of action. We are going through elections, and that is where most of the stress tests are then put in terms of democracy. One, you look at media access, space for NGOs to operate, space for political actors to operate, both local and international actors, national actors, and there are a number of things that have happened. There has been an NGO bill act of some sorts. There's a patriotic act of some sorts. There has been a lot of concern in terms of funding, restriction in terms of funding. The space, more requirements have been put on NGOs that are willing to operate or are able to operate in Zimbabwe. So a lot has been going on, and most of it, the jury is still out in terms of the implementation thereof. But there is a growing concern and a growing fear that the space that civic society is operating in is increasingly becoming restricted. Certainly for political parties, rallies are being banned, access to voters' roll, access to media in terms of articulating their viewpoints and agendas. I doubt if Nelson Chamisa has ever appeared on national TV, state TV speaking, save for where he is being castigated, ridiculed, or some sort. So the space is arguably shrinking, and a serious cause of concern. The state has an obligation to deal with civic society. It's a signatory to a number of African charters, United Nations instruments, and it is indeed a member of those bodies and is enjoined in terms of practices, instruments of those bodies to promote, safeguard, and ensure that civic space is there.
Thank you so much for that context. I think it's pretty broad, and most of the follow-up questions that I'm going to have will potentially have you expanding on some of the things that you've mentioned in the context setting. There's one thing I wanted to understand, maybe for most of our viewers, to say, what role does the government, both national and local, play in safeguarding the civic and democratic space? I know that you've mentioned a couple of ways in which there has been instruments in Zimbabwe that restrict the space. We will talk about that further down. But I think it'll be good for us to just understand on a basic level to say, what role does the government at national level, at local level, actually play in safeguarding the civic and democratic space?
Well, there is a question of that is, the answer is in two parts. What is it supposed to do? And then what it actually does. In most cases, those two are parallel railway lines, probably going to the same direction, but never meeting. And in many ways, moving and sometimes in contradiction to each other, derailing the whole train of civic society motion. You see what it's supposed to do in terms of the SADC protocols, in terms of the United Nations charters. It must make sure that they are able to operate. There's a legislative framework dealing with their registration, funding, operations, space that they ought to have, the freedoms, accreditation to certain bodies, cooperation with governmental organizations, entering into memorandum of understandings, implementing joint projects, working on legislation, legislative reform, removing illegitimate practices in key areas of concern, that is gender, children protection, human rights broadly, democracy, voter education. I mean, the whole gamut of what food, health, environment, and so forth, animal safety. So the whole range of civic space, and that's what they ought to do. But in most cases, legislation is passed without adequate consultation. The legislation is not co-sponsored. Practices sometimes select. One might argue that food NGOs, when there's hunger, they get more space to act. Where there's plenty, they are restricted. Health organizations maybe are given a bit more leeway because of the work that they do on diseases like HIV, COVID recently, and so forth. You'll find that they are able to marry their results, indicators, with the national priorities or with the international commitments of government. But when it comes to democracy, media, and other related organizations, that's where the whole thing becomes a dog's breakfast. There is repression, restrictions on registration, daily attacks, lack of cooperation on areas that need reform. In many cases, the laws are done in an opposite manner, where the civic society raises that it must be improved in this particular manner. The law actually is made worse, ironically. So that's where we are at with what a government does or ought to do and what actually happens on the ground.
I like how basic, but also very detailed your response has been. It's easy for an ordinary young person or ordinary person to actually understand the role of the government. The reason why I felt like there was a need for us to start from here was because we're more familiar with government restricting the civic and democratic space, not just in Zimbabwe, but broadly in different parts of the southern region and the continent. So I think there has not been enough that tells us that the government actually does have a role to positively influence the civic and democratic space. So I think just giving that context of what the government is supposed to do was good for a conversation. I also love the fact that you touched a bit on how the legislation can be used or has been used to restrict, especially the democracy, rights, governance sector. But I wanted to come in and ask for maybe some specific examples of how the government of Zimbabwe has supported, if it has, or undermined the civic and democratic space.
What's happening now is that there are challenges that civic society is facing in relation to the legislative framework. It has become more restrictive, more requiring a lot of things. And a number of other areas, funding, a lot of speechifying against civic society happening from government authors, articles. There is a sense that the space has become limited, and as you go out of urban areas, it is increasingly difficult for NGOs to operate. They are being monitored, their funding is being monitored, their accounts are being monitored, and sometimes it becomes very difficult to operate. They can face threats or arrests and so forth. And particularly election-based organizations, which normally used to work very well, are being subjected to more tests and a bit of hostility from government. And that happens when we approach elections, because there's a sense that their work aids the opposition more than it aids the incumbent.
I wanted to just pick it up from just the last thing you said about how there is a perception that the work of organizations, especially those that are working on elections, actually aids the opposition. And I wanted to pick on it because I do feel, or I've seen that it's actually spread across and not just on elections. There is a general sense that civil society exists to oppose government. And I think governments in general, and the Zimbabwean government included, tends to actually feed on that perception by convincing citizens that civil society are generally opposing the government and therefore seen as evil, and there being a need to control them through those laws that you've mentioned, and also just expanded on the fact that they're actually restricting the work of those organizations. And I just wanted to come in on how do we begin to manage the perception? Because I think it matters a lot for citizens on the ground as well. And it matters for the work of civil society. How do we begin to manage the perception challenge that exists?
Yeah, well, it's a bit more advocacy, then a bit more work that needs to be done in areas of popularizing international instruments that governments are party to, conditions of regional and international organizations, principles that are universal, principles that are common. It therefore must be that the work must be done to make people understand. We cannot alter the work of organizations that seek more transparency in elections, more equality on gender issues, more justice for children. It is a bad practice to try and bend the expectations and the work in those fields. We must and should work at it until the government and other state actors understand that it enhances them. And it's a good thing. Currently, a lot of people who used to be in government are now outside. Case in point, Kasukuwere, used to be part of the government. The same lack of reform we were complaining about is now being visited on him. So it's now up to us to be able to conscientize the people, conscientize the state actors, that one day it will be them wanting to also defend and understand the work of civic society.
Thank you so much for that. So the conversation has been a lot around government, almost as a separate to you. But when we introduced you, we did mention that you are the mayor of Harare. And the local government, again, does also have a role. So I wanted to just bring it down to your work as mayor and the local government that you lead, to say in what way do you as the local government play a role in supporting and strengthening the civic and democratic space?
We are also part and parcel of the tiers of government. We, as local authorities, we generally do not have issues with civic society. We have residents organizations that attack us day and night. And we do understand that it is their job to probe, to put us to task, to question, to air the views of the residents. Unfair, we might think, painful to hear, but it is part and parcel of what a democracy is. And we should be able to be open, transparent, and accountable at many levels. And we are also looking at supporting their work. We call them to our meetings. We try to do things together, build clinics together, build schools together, do outreach programs together, as it should be. And as local government, the more we are able to get the positive contribution from NGOs, we might lend, we might help the national tier of government to understand the benefits of having people who are able to critique, to improve, and to work with you from an independent point of view. And as local government and as a mayor, we welcome the contribution of civic society.
I like what you said about just how the way that you're engaging with residents and civil society might actually, in the long term, help government begin to see the utility of a stronger and more active civic society. It was going to, my next question was also centered around how to say, what are some of the best practices that the government should be adopting for safeguarding the civic and democratic space? I know you did mention a few across your nations, but are there any that you'd love to spotlight?
Can you run that by me again?
Yes, I was making reference to the statement that you included in your last submission to say that in the way that you're doing your work as local government to ensure there's an active citizenry, you're hoping that it will then teach mainstream or national government, to be more specific, about the utility of having a very active civil society and also just citizens in general. So it paves way to the next question I was going to ask you to say, what are some of the best practices that the government of Zimbabwe should be adopting to safeguard the civic and democratic space?
Part of it is to allow the civic society platforms to critique, to speak, to contribute, be it parliament, be it government processes, policy implementation. It's very critical that a policy be stress tested with NGOs, a law be stress tested with civic society, because they are going to look at the loopholes and also make people understand the implementation of such legislation. We must also look into issues of entering into memorandum of understanding, looking at the key indicators for the people, and try to synchronize and align those so that we know if you are aligning the constitution, if you are adopting international statutes, you log frame, time frame the issues so that it becomes a joint product that has been critiqued, that has been developed by civic society. Also to create pockets of funding that are independent, pockets of funding that do not compromise civic society. If you are complaining about funding from elsewhere, then create an independent fund for civic society that allows them to draw down from those funds and be able to contribute to society unfettered with unwanted funding or the sheer lack of the funding.
So I wanted to actually ask you, you know how us as young people in the different spaces that we meet and interact, young people between countries, particularly in Southern Africa, one of the things that we take away from all of the opportunities we get to meet is the opportunity for peer learning, to just see what other young people are doing in their countries and what they're doing right, thinking about how do we begin to adopt that in our countries. I would love to know what the role of governments in the region are in ensuring that they hold each other, I guess, accountable for the space within their countries. Like, do you see any learning happening? If there is no learning, what is the challenge?
Well, I think they will have to learn. The challenges of learning are that the toxicity and the polarization and the democratic struggle in Zimbabwe is more often than not pitted civic society on one side and the government on the other. And this mutual suspicion, if so to speak, is not aided the capacity of this government to learn from others. It looks at civic society with hostile lenses, with the view that these people are out to replace them as a government. And the words regime change agenda are often peddled and spoken on across all structures of the state. And this creates a state of panic, paranoia, schizophrenia, claustrophobia, and therefore they are blinded by their own fears of what they think civic society is going to do to their hold on power, to their ability to enjoy the fruits of power, and their ability to get away with impunity after enjoying certain fruits of power is the hindrance. I think they know how it needs to be done, where it needs to be done, but they're actively resisting it. In other words, if they learn a lesson, the lesson is learned in order to thwart the teaching rather than to learn from the teaching.
As we close, would you want to give any closing thoughts, any closing remarks?
Well, we are going into elections. We hope that they will be peaceful, that civic society will play a role in this election to make sure that it is transparent, it is fair, it is legitimate. The people of Zimbabwe want a break from toxic politics. They want to be able to continue with their lives and have a normal economy, have a normal political environment, and join the rest of the region in being able to enjoy the fruits of democracy, which they are currently not enjoying, the fruits of civic society work, which they are currently not enjoying. And this is quite sad and tragic, and it's something that needs to be dealt with.
Mr. Mayor, it has been great tapping into your perspectives on the subject of governments and their role in safeguarding the civic and democratic space. You've left us with a lot to chew, and thank you so much for making the time to be a part of this conversation. A special thank you to all our listeners. Would love to hear your feedback and thoughts on today's topic and conversation. Leave us a comment on the platform you're using to listen to this episode, or take us on a post on social media. Remember to share this podcast and follow Southern Defenders on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. You can visit our website, www.southerndefenders.africa, to get a broader sense of the work of the Southern Defenders. This is the Civic Space Today, a program of the Southern Defenders. I am Mandatin Loja, your host for today's episode. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next time. Together we defend.